The issues in this case are literally life and death issues for my family's business. That's why I felt it was so important for me to visit with you today personally to make sure you understand the impacts of your decision. Our business is family owned. We started from scratch 40 years ago. We now have over 200 employees that provide waste management services throughout southern New England. We have one of the largest C&D recycling facilities and MSW transfer facilities in the region. This case scares us. It does so because NET seeks to change the rules to create an uneven playing field. This case is really a question of whether the laws of this country will allow a company to engage in our business, the solid waste management business, without being forced to comply with the expensive legal requirements that apply to the rest of us. To me, this case is about whether the laws protect those of us who play by the rules, thrive on competition, or whether the laws will be applied to protect those who seek to avoid legal requirements and to allow them to compete unfairly. I want to address the board's questions relating to whether C&D and MSW should be considered differently from other commodities, and whether NET's proposed activities with respect to C&D and MSW would add value to these materials. To this, I need to describe for you what I do in my solid waste business and what NET says it intends to do and compare them. You can then judge whether what we do, what they do, is the same business. I'm totally convinced that it is. I like to point out that when I built my facility, I did so with a revenue bond because we were considered a manufacturing facility. And also, we didn't have to pay taxes on our equipment because we were considered a manufacturing facility. Recycling facilities employ basic processes to separate incoming mixed waste into different streams. The purpose of this separation is to take the commingled waste stream and divide it into segregated parts that have either lower disposal costs or some market value. For example, you can pick large pieces of wood out of a waste load and shred them to create chips that are marketable as fuel. Shredded wood currently has a low market value. You basically get paid what it costs to transport it to the user. But by separating the wood out of the waste stream, you avoid a $70 to $90 per ton disposal cost. Another much more lucrative example is metal. Construction and demolition debris can have a high metals content. When buildings are demolished, there are appliances, siding, pipes, wires, beams, fixtures, and the like. When these materials arrive at a site mixed into a demolition waste load, all you have is a $70 or $90 per ton liability. When they are separated, they have significant value. Our job is to extract the metal to create that value. The scrap metal markets have gone berserk in the last few years. To give you an example of how lucrative this can be, the price of nickel has just hit $50,000 per ton. The price of tin is now around $15,000 per ton, and copper is nearly $8,000 per ton. When you pull a piece of metal out of a waste stream, you can resell these metals for extraordinary value creation. Our recycling facility works like this. Trucks full of construction debris or industrial waste unload their waste onto our facility's concrete floor. An excavator with a large grapple attached grabs piles of debris and feeds it into an industrial shredder. The ground material is transferred to a conveyor belt, which helps us to see the materials to be sorted. Larger materials are separated from the waste stream by hand. Metals and wood are removed, as well as cardboard, brick, concrete, and asphalt. We recycle all materials we have a market for, and we dispose of what is left over in different locations depending on the cost of the particular stream. Some materials can be used as daily cover at landfills. This can be disposed of very cheaply as a substitute for dirt. Other materials can be sent to plants to be crushed and used for a road base. Whatever cannot be sent to the landfill or to these low-cost outlets actually gets sent to landfills and to combustion facilities for disposal. Compare what we do to the proposed NET facility. NET described in its November 2005 filing with the board that would segregate certain metal and wood with other materials that may damage NET's loading equipment and rail cars. Any segregated material would be transported to appropriate receiving facilities. NET also said it would use shredders and conveyor belts. C&D would convey to shredders that were reduced to a maximum size that can be loaded into rail cars with conveyor belts. Members of the board, why do you think NET wants to go to the trouble of shredding its incoming waste? I shred waste just like NET proposes. Shred is allowed. They create continuous maintenance problems. I know exactly what that's all about. They have to be fed with a constant stream of material, and they use a tremendous amount of electricity. They can also be dangerous. A shredder operated at a waste energy facility in Massachusetts recently exploded and caused a fire that took 150 firefighters to put out. Fortunately, no one was killed. The entire facility has been out of service all month, forcing the diversion of 3,000 tons of waste per day. What is the purpose of shredding material that arrives packed into trucks, material that you can crush with a loader if you want to densify it? The answer is that you don't need to use a shredder to pack a rail car, but you need to shred if you want to convert a liability into an asset. You can take a $70 or $90 per ton liability and turn it into a commodity by shredding it. You're literally creating money out of trash. Another use for shredders is to create a fuel from MSW. The same trashing facility I just mentioned receives waste by both rail and truck from many communities on Cape Cod and surrounding communities, and it shreds its waste prior to burning it. This is clearly not a transportation-related function since it occurs after the transportation is completed. Also, why do you think NET wants to use conveyor belts to transport waste in such a small facility? This is not a large plant where a conveyor belt is necessary to cover a distance. Use a conveyor in such a small operation to provide access to materials for segregation and to load materials once you've completed your processing. NET would have you believe that it will segregate wood and metals only to prevent damage to rail cars. Let me ask you a question. Do you believe that NET designed its facility so that there will be easy access to waste streams, but that it intends to sit by and watch these pieces of metal with a value up to $50,000 per ton pass by destined for a landfill? Do you believe that it will only pick out pieces of metal that are easily accessible from the waste stream, and if they are too large, and they will damage a rail car? That the rest of the valuable material that passes right under their noses, they will send to a landfill for disposal? How many tens of thousands of dollars will they literally be throwing in the garbage? This defies logic. It makes no sense, and should not view it as credible. Notice that NET admitted it will pull both metal and wood out of its waste stream and send it to appropriate receiving facilities, whatever those are, only to protect rail cars. To protect rail cars, why would they need to protect rail cars when most of the scrap metal in this country is moved via rail cars? Why does NET need to pick out wood if it has shredders? The purpose of a shredder is to reduce the size of the material. Of course, once you admit that you are shredding wood or picking out valuable metals, you admit that you have changed the waste into a marketable commodity, and they wouldn't want to admit that. There is no need to treat C&D and MSW differently from all the other commodities that are shipped by rail. Instead, we ask that you treat them the same. The board does not have exclusive jurisdiction over automobile manufacturing or metal foundries or scrap yards for that matter. For the same reason, you should not find that the board has exclusive jurisdiction over the value creation activities of solid waste management activities. We see no difference. The manufacturing process is not a rail transportation, and a manufacturing facility is not a rail facility. I'm asking the board to see what is blatantly obvious to me as a lifelong member of the solid waste management community. The processing activities described by NET are designed to be solid waste management activities. They intend to transform incoming mixed waste streams into valuable products, and they're planning to profit handsomely by this. Whether the profit is taken by NET, by a contract loader, or by the shipper, it doesn't matter. There's significant profit to be made in this operation, and that profit from activities that are not intimately related to providing rail service. NET is asking you to allow the operation of a solid waste business that competes with mine, but without being subject to expensive state and local controls. This is not fair, and you should see through this. I'm not afraid to compete with NET in a solid waste management business. We need to make sure the competition is fair. You also need to know that wood with a value of $17 a ton and metal with a huge value will not be going to a landfill. Thank you.
I'd say recycling some of that material. I think that's, of course, what the tariff would be that said. What we're saying is we find it very difficult to
comprehend that they would extract valuable materials from their incoming waste stream and then put them in the same rail cars that are going to landfills. That just doesn't make sense.
What's the criteria for membership in your trade association? And are any railroads members of your trade association right now?
Right now, I'm speaking for 4 different trade associations, which have hundreds and hundreds of members, and I don't know the answer to that question.
I'm not
Belong
sure.
to, okay. In your January 2006 reply, you argued that ICTA does not preempt state solid waste requirements. But if not, why do you think NET is trying so hard today to get board authority and thus preemption? Is this view on their part contradicted by our precedent and that of the courts?
Yes, absolutely. We think it is.
Doug?
Well, I have no questions for this panel.
Oh, wait. Let's see here. Mr. Richmond, can you quantify how much less operating costs are if an entity does not need to comply with a state regulatory scheme? What order of magnitude would be 50% less or more? What percentage of your operating costs are in fact caused by state regulatory requirements?
I'm not going to be able to give you figures. Mike may be better able since he is the current operator. But before I hand it over to Mike, let me just say that the NET proposal is for a fabric walled and roofed structure with essentially no siting costs. So there are 2 advantages to proceeding under a claim of exemption. The first is that they avoid the capital, well, actually there are 3 advantages. The first is that they avoid the time that it takes to get permits for a solid waste facility, which can be substantial. The second is they avoid the capital costs involved in building a facility that would be considered state-of-the-art by the state regulators. And the third would be the ongoing operating costs of complying with the regulations. And Mike maybe could speak to some of those.
Well, first of all, in the permitting process to develop our facility, it took 4.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
It cost $450,000. As it finally develop our facility and do it to meet all the regulations and do it in a first-class way, it cost $9 million. And we truly have a state-of-the-art facility protecting the environment. No concerns about the oversight. We understand what it's for and what it's doing, and we support it.
And if I may, just to emphasize a point here, we are not suggesting that it should take anyone 4.5 years to install a transload facility. That can happen overnight. What we're suggesting is the add-on activity which changes the value of incoming goods. That's the activity that takes a lot of time to permit and tremendous costs to build.
Well, in fact, this proposal, this petition is already taking quite a bit of time, whether it's a transload facility or a processing facility. It is also true that the New England Transrail says that its facility is, I believe I'm quoting Mr. Van Tine, state-of-the-art. But why would a facility that was simply taking material from trucks onto a floor and then onto a rail car need to be quote-unquote state-of-the-art if indeed that's all it was doing? When you say state-of-the-art, you're referring, of course, to the processing, separation, sorting, and recovering of valuable resources, correct?
Correct.
Our property has the proper stormwater controls. We have drains in our building that go through an oil water separation system before it's sent out to the local sewer systems. We have dust control systems, odor control systems, and a lot of other systems in place to protect the environment as required by the state and the local community that we're in.
Thank you.
Vice Chairman Buttry, questions? Mr. Camara, tell me about your association. Are you exclusively truck-related business members, or do you have members of the association who engage in waste management, but with a railroad component to it?
Yes, we have.
So you do both? Okay.
Yes.
Breakdown roughly, I mean, it would be like 90% what I would call more traditional truck-based, 10% rail, or
absolutely
something like that. Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, virtually all of the facilities are quote-unquote truck-based because they're fed by trucks. But then several of the facilities have rail access, and so those obviously use the rail for shipping material out.
Mr. Conveyor, you mentioned some, your family's competitive concerns, and that's certainly a legitimate concern. I don't blame you for being concerned about that. Would those concerns be the same if someone was just going to do a transload, pure transload container, gets picked up, never opened, from a truck, placed on a rail bed and taken away? If that's what the proposal transformed into, or some other proposal down the street from you, and in your competitive market were to enter and do.
We compete against facilities like that now, and it doesn't concern us.
Okay. Mr. Camara, there's been a lot of discussion of shredding, and how small do you shred? You described the shredding that takes place in your operations. Is it done to a particular size, or does it depend on what you're shredding? Or because we heard some testimony earlier about shredding that NET might want to do. They tried to, I think, say that it wasn't to add value, it was just to make it easier to transport. Tell me about your shredding.
We have 3 different shredders in our facility. There's a primary shredder that's used to size the material down to a 24-inch minus. This allows us to, when we get in the activity of watching the materials go over our conveyor belts, we have better access of the size to be able to pick out the recyclable items. But also, due to concerns with the local landfills, we have a shredder that reduces and recycles mattresses, box springs, and furniture. On the back end of our operation, because we make a product on the back end that's used for landfill cover material, we have a shredder that reduces it down to a 3-inch minus.
Okay. And what is the commercial value added in shredding C&D, which is, as described by NET today, to 2-foot by 2-foot sizes?
In doing that, it makes it a lot easier to pull valuable pieces of metal off the waste stream. It's at a size that can easily move via conveyor. Let me picture this: if you try to take some large pieces of wood and move them via conveyors, they get jammed up. It causes problems in the system. To shred it down and take it down to that 24-inch minus, the material will move very easily over a conveyor system. But also, but it also allows the ability of someone to spot materials that have a value and be able to take those materials off the conveyor belt.
And if I may add to that, NET has admitted that they will be segregating out some wood. Wood as a separate commodity, separated from a C&D stream, has inherent value. It's used as a fuel at combustion facilities, and shredding it will help to prepare it for use as that fuel. So you're taking a material that you would otherwise have to dispose of, separating it out, shredding it so that it is more likely to be usable as a fuel, and then you have a product which can be sold. And there's a market for that today in New England.
Okay. Mr. Camara, this is helpful because you're one of the few people here today who actually works in this field day in, day out. We have people here who would like to maybe, or do something related, others who, but you're actually out there, and so doing this, and you know how it works.
40 years worth of experience.
Let me ask you, what about, in your view, is if someone says they want to bale something so they can eat more easily and more efficiently get it into a rail car, is that processing in your eyes?
Absolutely.
Explain that to me. I'm not an expert in this, and at first thought I said, oh, it makes sense. You got to get it into the car, and it's a whole bunch of pieces of stuff. I guess you're going to bale it. And what value added is baling? I mean, when it gets to the destination, is the landfill operator glad to see the bale? I mean, what is it about that makes that processing?
Well, you have to look at the 2 different ways where you can load material into rail cars. In many cases, it's loaded with a grapple, as you see in that picture there, and it's loaded over the top of a rail car. In this case here, by processing it, manipulating it, baling it, it gives you access to different types of rail cars, especially if you wrap it. You could have a freight car that might come into the community that might be carrying a specific commodity like a food product, and you couldn't just take raw waste baled and put it into that car because it would cause odors and problems that could permeate into those food products. Bale it and wrapping it gives you an opportunity to process it and make it into a commodity that you could actually put into a rail car that might be used for different types of processes that you couldn't simply put loose waste into.
And
So if I hear you correctly, one of the benefits of baling and or wrapping would be it allows you to use your rail car for other purposes more easily because you have perhaps less of smell or odor. So it's in that respect, I guess, you didn't say this, but I'll say it. It advances multiple transportation purposes. It potentially allows more efficient loading onto the rail car, but also allows your rail car to be turned around and put back into commerce quicker at the end of it all, which are two, I would say, pretty reasonable transportation purposes. But let me let you respond to that.
It actually that is a benefit, and you could also put it into transport trailers that might have brought refrigerated waste, food products rather, into the area, and you can send it out that way because it would protect the different types of transportation that you use. But also you have to look at the fact that bringing that waste in, MSW waste, I handle a lot of it every single day. I have a permit to handle 15 tons of waste per day. A lot of liquid waste come in with those loads. That has to be dealt with to protect the environment. A lot of odors are generated with that waste, especially in the summer months. It gets very hot, humid, and it can be pretty horrific to deal with. There is the issue, and I'm glad you spoke of fire protection, because that's very important. I can point to the fact that we had a fire in our facility a couple of years ago, and within seconds our fire suppression system knocked the fire out, so I'm glad you're taking a good hard look at that. But more importantly, you have to look at, in a typical transload facility, movement of material into a tipping floor, gets loaded into a rail car, and it's out. It's off to wherever it's going to go. In this case here, there is processing taking place because you are manipulating. You're shredding, conveying, and you have to convey into a baler.
So you see a difference between, in your mind, a transload facility. It doesn't have to be a processing facility. Mm-hmm. And so where's the line? We heard earlier a lot of talk about, and I was doing a lot of talking about the dumping out onto the ground and then the scooping up with a piece of equipment, as in that photo there. Is that processing in your mind? That's all they're doing? Let me ask Mr. Conveyor. He's in the field. I'll let you have a chance to answer as well.
I think are you asking from a legal perspective?
No, I'm asking from a practitioner's perspective. He's in the field. He's speaking as a practitioner. So you're not speaking as a lawyer, are you?
No.
Right. We've got a lot of lawyers here. I'm a lawyer. Mr. Buttrey's a lawyer. Half the audience is probably lawyers. But, plenty of us. Some would say too many. I'm glad to hear someone who actually does this for a living, knows how. Is the dumping on the ground and the just picking up and dropping into a rail car, is that processing in the business?
Let me just clarify. In Massachusetts, and I can only speak on behalf of Massachusetts,
sure.
When a permit is issued to a facility, they either permit a small waste handling facility or a large waste handling facility. It doesn't make a difference what you do. The only difference would be is the description of the activity that's going to happen at a small waste handling facility or a large waste handling facility. They all get permitted. In our case, because we have a 1,500 ton per day facility, we consider a large waste handling facility. In our facility, not only do we process wastes, we do transload waste. So it's a mixed waste facility. We handle both construction and demolition debris. We also handle MSW. But I also like to say that a lot of the MSW loads that we bring in, if they have recyclables, we don't put them in rail cars or put them in tractor trailers to be hauled off the property. It all gets processed. It all gets recycled.
So you try to put yourself in our shoes. We're trying to just figure out what the difference is, if there is one, between transportation and integral to transportation, and processing, and sort of understand where that line might be. So Mr. Richmond, I'll give him a chance to respond momentarily. He encouraged us to try to draw some lines, right?
Yes.
And we've had different people today say different things about where those lines should draw. If we're interested in trying to allow something that looks more traditionally like a transportation operation, it's more like a transload operation in your mind, go forward. But we're not interested in approving or sanctioning preemption for some type of waste processing. But someone says, well, what we want to do is dump municipal solid waste and or C and D on the floor, scoop it right up and drop it into the car of a train and have it leave. Is that processing in your mind as a practitioner?
I can easily answer that question.
Please.
I know you're anxious for the answer. If all you're going to do is 100% pick that material up with an excavator or a payloader and load it into a rail car, it's not processing. But I don't know of anyone that does that. Every facility that I go to, they will use that excavator. They will pull out large pieces of metal, and they'll pull out other valuable items before it goes into the rail car, and that's processing.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Richmond?
Yes, excuse me. Our position is that activities which change the value of the incoming material constitute processing. So we don't believe that bringing in waste and dumping it on the floor and picking it up and putting it into a rail car changes the value of that material. And we think that's a pretty easy call. We do think that the states will have police power authorities to regulate that activity. We can quibble about whether they have permitting authority, but certainly police power authority, because you're taking a material that's a waste and you could be putting it on the ground. So the question for us is, what is the value of the material when it comes in, and what is the value of the material at each step of the process? And when we talk about the state's definition of processing, which was a topic of some discussion in the last panel, I would submit to you respectfully that that may be the wrong question, because at the point at which the state's regulations apply in terms of what's processing, what's handling, is not the relevant inquiry. I believe the relevant inquiry is what is integrally related to the transportation function. And once you determine what's integrally related, everything prior to that point would become subject to state jurisdiction. But where the state draws the line in its permitting regulations is not relevant.
So, Mr. Richmond, following your line of reasoning, if a local or state government were to be concerned about coal transportation and different coal activities that take place frequently at rail facilities, if they can make the case to us that something is done to that coal that actually adds value to it, for example, separating out, a certain grade of coal or fly ash and putting it in different cars so that it sells easier and higher value at the destination, that's actually processing.
No, I think your question is not analogous to the situation we're dealing with.
But you said that anything that adds value is processing.
I said you need to look at the value-adding activity. Anything that adds value.
Not anything that adds value equals processing.
No,
adding value could equal processing. Is that
correct,
what you're saying?
correct. This board has not used a...
Very different, you have to admit, very different proposition between the
yes.
always and the possible or the could.
That's
okay.
correct. I mean, this board has looked at whether there's an integral relationship. If there's an integral relationship and there's some value added, I think it's fully within your rights to determine that that falls within preemption. But you need to look at both of those things. And I think that the value that's being added in a processing activity is a critical inquiry that has been missing heretofore.
Okay. Mr. Camara, I want to put you in a different line of business, okay, just hypothetically. You are in the truck business focused on delivering brand new cars from large distribution points like ports and rail yards, et cetera, to dealerships. And that's your business. You got to get the cars there in good shape, and you got, special rigs, truck rigs, that chassis that deal with that. And in comes railroad, and a railroad has a yard nearby, and they decide to pave over part of their yard in order to unload brand new cars that they deliver from the port, let's say the port of LA, Long Beach or something, onto the rail property, and then sort out the cars. They put all the Hondas in some cars. They put all the Toyotas in other cars because it makes a lot of business sense for them to make different drop-offs as they take the train out into the marketplace. And all of a sudden, your business is suffering because that's exactly the kind of thing you did, and you have all different regulations you had to deal with. You had to get a CDL license, et cetera. Would that be processing in your mind of new cars at a rail facility? You don't need to answer that, Mr. Fletcher, but Mr. Richmond can. But I say it because I think that happens a lot, actually, in routine rail operations. The automotive industry is a very sort of core bread and butter part of the rail industry, and I just want to make sure as we think through this, how we have some consistency. I'll let Mr. Camara answer this.
it seems to me is that that is just a straight railroad activity, moving commodities across this country. It happens all the time. And so I noticed that in traveling, I've seen freight cars with cars travel across this country, and I understand the benefit of that happening.
Mr. Richmond?
We do not have a problem with auto transloading, auto storage. We don't have a problem with diesel engine repair facilities. We don't have a problem with maintenance activities that occur, which are necessary for rail activities. I do not see these as difficult cases. They're integrally related, and I think this board would agree with that. The question is whether the activity of processing waste is integrally related. And what I think we're trying to provide you with information on is that there is a business out there that conducts this activity for profit, and the application which is in front of you has been devoid of information about that industry and about that profit motive to date.
Thank you. Vice Chairman Butcher, any additional questions? Mr. Mulvey?
Well, one question and a point. Isn't there a difference here between what we're talking about municipal solid waste and with coal, for example, or with automobiles, that municipal solid waste is something that is traditionally regulated by state and local governments as part of their police powers for protecting the public health and welfare?
That certainly has been true.
Mm-hmm. But that's not true of the other materials like coal or automobiles. I mean, these are not regulated normally for the public health and well-being. I mean, certainly one could consider that if you found, for example, in the activities that railroads were doing in processing coal and mixing coal, I mean, all coal is not the same, they mix it for different plants or things like that. If it were found that the process of mixing the coal was causing fugitive dust to get into the atmosphere and causing high rates of cancers in communities nearby those facilities, then it may very well be true that that would be something that the states might want to and legitimately could regulate. But that isn't the case. But with municipal solid waste, there's lots of evidence that these operations historically have caused problems with groundwater, have caused problems with air quality, and have therefore been regulated. Is that?
I think that is true. I would caution the board, however, that relying on police powers for a resolution to this entire issue won't, in my humble opinion, will not get you there. Because the police powers reservation has been focused on health and safety requirements, and the railroads have made a very clear demarcation between what they believe is a health and safety requirement and what may be an environmental requirement. And I think it's only under duress in this particular instance that NET has offered that it will submit to some environmental requirements, but we don't know which. And what I heard them say today was that they would consider anything reasonable. Well, that may be true, but the devil is in the details here. And when we talk about some of the requirements that are applied under Massachusetts law, in the citing requirements, Massachusetts law is not set up to provide performance standards. It's set up to provide permitting processes in which performance requirements are established. So there are setback requirements, for instance, assuming enclosed structures with real walls. What is the DEP going to do when it sits down in a negotiation with the NET who wants to put a fabric hut up and they look at setback requirements? I know what I would do if I were NET. I'd say there's no hard and fast requirement in your law that says I must be set back a certain amount. That would be a pre-clearance requirement. And that will come back to the board. What's going to happen when we look at throughput limits? The DEP, in virtually every case, establishes throughput limits. They're not requirements of the law. There's no law that says, or regulation that says, you can only have a certain amount of tonnage per day. But every permit has that, and it's a fundamental attribute of a state solid waste permit. What is NET going to do when DEP says we need a throughput limit? That's going to come back to you too. Waste type limitations, activities limits, hours of operation. I could list 50 things that are going to come up where I would imagine a railroad, assuming NET is a railroad, would fight back and say these are not reasonable restrictions.
Thank you very much.
A question, Mr. Richmond. You mentioned that the desirability, the need for this board to identify a bright line test that would help resolve cases such as this, disputes and controversies such as this. You talked about looking to see whether something is being done to increase the value of a commodity in transportation. But then we talked a little bit about that. That wasn't really the bright line test. That was a consideration we should look at, if I follow you correctly. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what is the bright line test? Let me try to hear you say it one more time.
Actually, what I had hoped to convey in my opening comments was that it seemed that there was a consensus that guidance from this board would be very helpful on this issue, and I'm perfectly happy to talk about guidance. And I think if you were to say that value-added activities create a per se presumption, and the board is going to scrutinize those closely to determine whether they are integrally related to rail or if they're in fact related to some other business function, that would be helpful guidance.
And if something actually, hypothetically, let's just say, if an activity was widely viewed as integrally related to transportation, but it actually also, coincidentally, is an activity that happens very commonly in another setting, like MSW processing, what do you advise that we do? We have a law that tells us as soon as we see something that's integrally related to transportation, it doesn't tell us to go explore what else, how we could ignore that fact if we can find it that it's actually the same activity that's found present in another transaction or operation.
Right. I'm afraid I can't answer that in the abstract, but I'm happy to answer it with a concrete example.
Okay, let's do a concrete example. Let's say we hypothetically, we stipulated that, so it's not really hypothetical, but we would stipulate that the depositing of, which your client helped me understand more, your colleague, excuse me, Mr. Camara, municipal solid waste is taken out of a truck, deposited on a concrete floor, and then picked up, no separation, no anything else, no bailing, and deposited in the back in a container for rail transportation. That sounds to me could be, and let's just, that could or could not be, that could definitely arguably be integral to transportation. Mm-hmm. Depending who you ask, it could be waste processing, but I think I heard Mr. Camara said he's never seen it happen by itself, but if it did happen by itself, he didn't think it really would be processing. But then you add in, let's say, they want to bail it up so they can fit a little more onto the rail car for more efficient transportation purposes. Mm-hmm. They're not bailing it up so they can somehow extract profit later down in the stream, or they're not really adding value other than just being able to get more stuff onto the transportation. It's an integral transportation. Mm-hmm. There, I heard Mr. Camara say and others say, well, that's processing. Bailing's processing. But couldn't a reasonable person say, well, it's also integral to transportation?
Well, Mr. Chairman, when you were asking Mr. Camara those questions, you were asking about processing generically, and you'll remember I jumped in and I asked, are you asking for a legal conclusion? And that's because of this precise problem. When an operator in Massachusetts hears processing, they're thinking, what is subject to DEP permitting under the DEP processing requirements? And I believe that's fundamentally different than your jurisdiction and the questions that are before this board. So we would look at value creation, and I don't see value creation in the chain of activities that you just discussed. I do think bailing may have a different analysis associated with it, because a lot of material NET has admitted will come to it bailed, or some material will come to it bailed, and therefore it's more of a packaging issue. And the question I would ask is whether manufacturers of computers could send their individual computers to a transload facility and ask them to box the computers, whether that would be subject to your exclusive jurisdiction. My thought is you would have some question about whether that's integrally related to rail transportation. I don't know that it's an easy answer, but I pose that as a question. So when I look at bailing, that's the analysis I do. I don't see value creation.
Bailing, and did I hear you say some types of wrapping might not be value enhancing as well?
I guess I see the bailing and the wrapping as similar, yes. Okay,
so bailing and wrapping are not necessarily value creating, so presumably they shouldn't raise too many alarm bells about not being integral to transportation. So they would be integral to transportation, and since they don't add value, we don't even necessarily, following that logic, need to worry about those discrete transactions. There are a lot of other things here at issue in this case, being processing.
No, under the value creation argument, that's correct. I still think there's this question about whether bailing is appropriately a packaging activity, which is typically done by the shipper, or whether it is is done primarily by the transloader for purposes of facilitating the rail shipment. That I don't have an answer to. You'd need more facts on that. So
if somebody's just wrapping something up so that it can use the car later quicker because it won't smell as much, and also so that it can more of it can fit efficiently into a rail car, and then when it gets to a landfill, it's just dumped like with everything else in a landfill. There's no added value once it's at the landfill of being baled or wrapped. If that were the case, you'd have transportation activity with no processing element, correct?
If that were the case, yes.
Okay. I think we're starting to make a little progress here in understanding this. I appreciate you bearing with me on that. These are important questions.
Absolutely.
We've had a lot of different answers by a lot of smart people, so I'm just trying to really understand it. That's all I have. Any other questions for this panel?
No, thank you.
Seeing none, thank you so much.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Camara?
Yes, one more comment. We built that facility back in 2002, and before we built it, I traveled all over the country looking at facilities. And another business that I own, which is the odor control business, visited a lot of transfer stations and similar facilities to provide services for odor control. And in visiting all those facilities, all different types of facilities, in every single case, people were pulling materials out that had value. I never visited a facility that strictly took material from the tipping floor, loaded it into a car, and sent it away. It just didn't make economic sense.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Thank you, panel. You're dismissed. You're welcome to stay as long as you like today. Observe.
Thank you.
We will move forward to the next panel. And that would be panel 5. Mr. Daniel Deutsch of the town of Wilmington for 15 minutes. Kathleen M. Barry of the Wilmington Woburn Collaborative. Susan Cleaver, both for 5 minutes, Ms. Barry and Ms. Cleaver, and for 10 minutes, Mr. Carter H. Strickland, Jr. from the Raritan Baykeeper and Hackensack Riverkeeper organizations. Welcome. You've been very patient today, and we very much appreciate your participating. I think we're going to start with Mr. Deutsch. Whenever you're ready, please proceed. He's leaving.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity for us to appear before you in person. We value the process and believe that it's essential to your decision making and has implications, as we will note in the course of our argument, for the concerns that we all have with the preemption issue and the proper role of state and local governments in regulating solid waste as well. I'd like first of all to introduce my partner, Paul Durensis, who is town council for the town of Wilmington, also of the firm Deutsch Williams, Brooks, Durensis & Holland in Boston. Also with us today is John Gilbert of the engineering firm of Geo Insight Incorporated, which is the engineering consultants for the town of Wilmington, and Michael Kyra, who is the town manager for the town of Wilmington and therefore charged with speaking with us on behalf of the town. We have essentially here 2 sets of tracks, regulatory tracks, that threaten to converge. They threaten to converge here in Washington before this board and in Wilmington, Massachusetts. If they were to intersect, it would create huge problems, we maintain, for this board, as well as in Wilmington, but they need not conflict. We maintain that only a finding of no preemption would keep them parallel. The 2 bodies of federal law are ICTA, which grants to this board exclusive jurisdiction over, as folks have noted all day, rail transportation and those operations that are legitimately integral to the ability of the carrier, a legitimate rail carrier, to provide rail transportation on the one hand, and RCRA Subtitle D, regulating solid waste, and other federal laws concerning directly and indirectly the management of solid waste, all of which, as some commentators here, but not all, have noted, focus on state and local governments, as Commissioner Mulvey has noted as well, as the primary entities to plan, regulate, and enforce in that field. And this is an essential distinction, essential feature that distinguishes C&D and MSW from other commodities. Regulating public health and safety is at the core of historically state functions. Some here are necessarily prone to view the issues before this board through the lens of rail activity. In fact, interestingly, early in today's hearing, the Transrail representative, Mr. Van Tine, said this is the last mile of track to connect existing rail service to the community of Wilmington. That would be viewed through the railroad lens. Viewed through the lens, however, of the affected site and the affected community of citizens and the affected community of state and local regulatory bodies, this would be the first mile of railroad for this site. Railroad is a new venture here, whereas waste issues have persisted and continue at the site. And as the chairman has made clear, what we're dealing with is not merely picking up and putting waste down, but New England Transrail proposes to dump, sort, segregate, shred, grind, bale, a full panoply of waste processing operations. Waste processing is not railroading. Likewise, the site permitting process is a distinct body of law, independent of transportation. It addresses the suitability of a particular land for use in waste processing. It is about the use or abuse of land in connection with a very particular and environmentally risky business operation. It's not about the who we maintain, but about the where and how. And this contrasts with the Washington, D.C. ordinance. It was a subject of board proceedings some years ago that required a permit for the passage of hazardous cargoes within or near the district limits. Unlike those regulations, the site regulations, the site assignment process at issue here do not presume to restrict rail transportation. Viewed in its simplest terms, some sites may not be suited to certain industrial activities. This portion of the oil and chemical site is the Superfund hazardous waste site with at least 196 chemical constituents and a human carcinogen, NDMA. It has subterranean contaminant cell with containment walls. It lies directly above an aquifer that is the primary source of local drinking water, and whose contamination has forced the closure of 60% of the town's wells. It's barely within the early stages of EPA investigation study, which is proceeding very slowly and with an uncertain funding and timeline, although it is the EPA's province and prerogative to ensure that the environmental problems raised here are fully vetted and appropriate necessary measures are implemented. But it is this site that Transrail has selected to construct and operate, among other facilities, a plant to engage in all of these solid waste processing activities involving solid waste, which itself contains hazardous components. And having looked primarily to the state and local governments to regulate and implement standards in this field, it is inconceivable, we believe, that Congress intended to have them take a back seat in such circumstances just because the proponent of those activities wishes to incorporate it into a business plan that also would include rail transportation. There are two regulatory fields are distinct, and that distinction can and should be preserved. Transrail has said that it intends to comply with all substantive health and safety laws, except, it says, for site assignment permitting and the waste ban laws. In fact, Mr. Tyne's statement in response to the Vice Chairman's question whether whether Transrail was, in effect, doing everything it could to address health and safety issues other than submitting to the state's jurisdiction. State affirmed that the site assignment process is, in fact, the guts, the main course of regulation, federally delegated to the states in the area of health and safety laws when it comes to waste processing. We believe that the question of preemption and of any burden on interstate commerce may be answered in a way that is specific to the very unusual circumstances here, and that leaves only a modest footprint on the field of rail regulation. It's a fact-based determination that requires careful examination of the regulatory environment as well as the details of the proposed activity itself. Those unusual circumstances are, first of all, that this proponent seeks to enter the rail field and under that umbrella to enter another distinct field of waste processing. Since there is no history here of railroading authorization, There is no existing railroad activity that must be accommodated or facilitated. Number two, this petitioner seeks to bring rail activity to a location where there presently is none. But there is other activity. There is activity in investigating and remediating hazardous waste that implicates a whole other body of law. Since there is no active railroading here, no active railroad presence at the site, there's no expectation of rail activity or of other activities that purportedly facilitate rail transportation. The third distinction, Transrail would undertake not only one activity, but a sequence of waste handling and processing operations, which it does not recognize as adding value to the material, rather only facilitating what it says purportedly is its sole rail mission, but which non-rail solid waste processors like Mr. Camara recognize as their bread and butter, and which state and municipal authorities recognize as such. So whatever they may possibly do to improve the efficiency or the economies of proposed rail transportation, those activities also comprise an established non-rail business enterprise, as distinguished from, for example, Mr. Moats referred to this morning, heating corn syrup, inspecting car chassis, or mixing grain. Fourth, the operations here are of a type that are primarily and best regulated by state governments and by extension local governments who have an intimate knowledge of the relevant circumstances, the knowledge of recognized and essential role, and a knowledge of the location of wetlands, aquifers, and sensitive environmental receptors. So there is a precedent for state and local regulation in the field in question here. And not only a precedent, but a mandate for it and a practice of it. And finally, consistent with that delegation of solid waste regulating authority to the states, Massachusetts has a long-standing rail-neutral regulatory process to evaluate in advance the suitability of solid waste activities for a particular site. As I alluded to at the beginning of opening, this is a public process that's neither arbitrary nor discriminatory, but requires adherence to established standards and careful consideration of enumerated factors to which Mr. Richmond began to allude, of which he said he could count 50. These are not rogue regulations. This is not pot shots being taken at the rail industry. All of this, of course, does not account for the serious problems inherent in this particular site, or the fact that this proponent was not forthcoming in its original submissions to this board on the very issue of waste processing. And we agree with certain other parties here that Transrail has repeatedly strained to clarify, even today, or adapt its proposal to more easily come within some concept of preemption. And this has occurred only in response to questions and concerns raised by the various participants and by this board. So that its contentions on this issue should even now be viewed with some considerable skepticism. And yet Transrail has the burden on this aspect of its petition. Building on this unusual constellation of circumstances I've described, we believe this board may consider ruling along the following lines: that interstate commerce is not unduly burdened, and that federal railroad laws do not preempt railroad-neutral state and local site suitability analysis and permitting when a rail carrier, if indeed Transrail is such, proposes to create new rail access to a location and to conduct there, among other activities, a sequence of solid waste handling or processing activities that ordinarily are subject to such existing railroad-neutral permitting. The very tangible interests and the health of the citizens who live in Wilmington, Massachusetts, should not be sacrificed or shortchanged for the sake of principles of rail efficiency, which are not even clearly fulfilled here, inasmuch as Transrail's representatives today have acknowledged that at most their best case is on the periphery of this preemption analysis, because at most, in their view, the solid waste operations in which they would engage facilitate, and not more, facilitate rail transportation. And those interests need not be sacrificed because this board can draw the line on its exclusive jurisdiction in a way that serves legitimate regulatory needs with respect to both railroad transportation and solid waste processing. A few additional comments that I believe are important and of use to the board. Some of these relate to the presentations of others earlier today, in particular Transrail. I don't recall the gentleman's name, may have been Mr. Klemper. Principal stated that would segregate substances for solid waste, from solid waste, because landfills will not accept them, such as refrigerator coolants, light ballasts, and so forth. Landfills won't take those substances because the landfills are regulated. And yet Transrail asks this board to rule in a way that would preempt, dispense with such regulatory processes applicable to the very business of sorting, shredding, grinding, and baling those materials at this site. Additionally, counsel for Transrail this morning made a point that some overtures had been made to establish a dialogue with the parties. No dialogue was ever engaged in with the town of Wilmington. In fact, initiatives made by the town and its representatives failed because our calls weren't returned. There has been no discussion or dialogue on that point. This is an evolving proposal, an evolving presentation, and one that is rife with inconsistencies and inaccuracies. Mr. DeMacy earlier today expressed a concern that local regulators tend to over-regulate. In this case, certainly, there is not a risk of over-regulation. The pre-clearance permitting at issue here is a site assignment process that involves the application of existing detailed standards according to extended formal public hearings with a public participation component at which we can only strain today. It does not lend itself to arbitrary decision-making or over-regulation. It itself is regulated. It's been suggested that perhaps this board might conditionally approve or grant preemption conditional upon subsequent recurrent inspections and compliance after the fact with enforcement measures. We say this would be too little, too late. It's not enough to give a speeding ticket to a runaway train in a busy neighborhood. In this case, solid waste processing could cause great damage, irretrievable damage, before any action might be taken to suspend that activity. The ability to monitor may have been lost. Monitoring wells may not have been required, installed. And there's a double threat here. Not only the release of hazardous materials into this already contaminated, burdened environment, but also the release of substances that may alter the characteristics, alter the solubility, for example, of existing contaminants. And there is the economic component. An established facility with economic incentives to challenge every attempt to police violations after the fact, causing delays, inefficiencies, and uncertainty in the results, in the outcome. Yes, thank you.
30 seconds.
Yes. In short, as the chairman has noted early on, Wilmington, more than most communities, has been subject to more than its share of environmental damage and burdens on it presented by abuse of land and of unregulated activities or activities that have been dealt with only after the fact. There is no adequate substitute for pre-clearance permitting in the case of solid waste from the environmental standpoint, and from a regulatory standpoint, the federal laws that apply have specifically delegated that role to the states. In that sense, municipal solid waste and C&D are a different commodity, and this board is in a position to reconcile its concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deutsch. We'll now hear from Ms. Kathleen Barry.
Thank you very much. I represent the Wilmington Movement Collaborative. My name is Kathleen Barry. I'm a resident of Wilmington. We have been actively involved with this site since 2002, when a C&D facility prior to NET came in to Wilmington to try to redevelop this site. I don't know how successful we were, but the C&D facility pursuit at that time was declined by the present owners, Owen Chemical Corporation. I'm here to give a community face on all of this. I'm pretty much very honored to be representative of the community and to give that voice to you and put that face to you. When I first learned last week that we were not a non-party of record, I filed an appeal with you, and I thank you very much for allowing me to appear. It was surprising to me because when this proposal was brought forward to the community in a very local, a handful of residents met with Mr. Klumpner and Mr. Jones, we filed, in the community, filed over 700 to 1,000 petitions based on the rail reload facility only. They came to us, they described to us what they were going to do, and we objected, and we still object to that. I'd like to make three main points here today. I would like to point out the site incompatibility. I would also like to talk about the EPA, as far as we're concerned, has the jurisdictional governing authority. And I'd also like to talk about when the project was first presented to us. Regarding site incompatibility, this site, as previously stated, has a long, sordid history of contamination. It has affected two watersheds, the Aberdona going down into Woburn and the Ipswich watershed in Wilmington. And in particular, it has affected our drinking water wells and our drinking water supply and our aquifer. We have lost 60% of our drinking water supply because of this site. Ammonia and nitrogen compounds and its exposure to the public could have been over or up to 20 years. We have a childhood cancer study going on by the Department of Public Health that has identified an occurrence of over 2.5 times the normal. We have, in our activities, we were fortunate enough to forge a relationship between Tufts University and the Department of Public Health so that they can look at the exposure patterns from the Owen property to the drinking water wells, out to the homes, to determine exactly how much, when the contamination may have gotten to each of the homes. This is a formidable study. It is a very serious study. When we were going through that study, I met up with Assistant Commissioner of the Department of Public Health. At that time, we were also fighting bringing in soils and contaminated material into a landfill. And she told me, Kathy, we were looking at the precautionary principle. And she said, Kathy, you don't know. You people shouldn't be bringing in things into your community. You should be taking it out. We say that, and you've heard insult to injury, we think that this is much more like pouring salt into an open, seeping wound. In the literal sense, this operation will certainly exacerbate this severely damaged and highly sensitive environment. I find it quite poignant and somewhat ironic that you would have this hearing today exactly 1 year later after the EPA has determined that this site meets its bar for Superfund. We sat and talked to the Superfund folks, and they detailed the process of doing their remedial investigation, their site assessments, their feasibility studies, and so on and so forth. And I spoke directly to one of the people there at that level, and I said, you know, has this ever happened before, where you had a proponent coming in prior to your analysis? And she said no, in Region 1. She was the woman who did the study for the hazardous ranking score proposal for the Superfund site. So this is tremendously precedenting. We feel that the EPA should have unfettered access. We feel that they should be the authority. They should have the jurisdictional authority. Tim Conway of the I sent this to you, and Region 1 commented, and he said the EPA cannot consent to any activity at this site until it makes its own determination that the site is safe for human health and the environment, and that the proposed use will not exacerbate site conditions or hinder the EPA's remaining investigation. We feel that they should be the final word on redevelopment, on who goes in there, what goes in there, and that should be on their time frame. And lastly, I'd like to just quickly, if I may beg the board for additional time. The Wilmington Woburn Collaborative is addressing the question of the board on how the project was conceived. We met with Mr. Clumpton and Mr. Jones in 2003 at the behest of John Tierney. He's our United States representative. At that time, they told us it was going to be a rail-to-truck reload facility only. Everything would be in concealed containers, just as you have described. There would be transloading of those containers onto trucks using one sprung structure with no holding areas. The only thing that was going to be dumped on the ground was lumber, and that it would occur in the wee hours of the morning between 1 and 6 a.m. The presentation was weak. It was unprofessional. The application was fraught with error, calling names of streets incorrectly, showed that they had no intention of working in the community to find out who we were and what kind of impact it would have on us. We asked about C&D fines because we had just stopped a C&D facility going in there. The answer was no. We have no intention. We just heard that they have no intention of being a recycling facility. We heard that same no about it being a C&D, having C&D operations in solid waste. We asked about nuclear waste. The answer there was more unclear. They said they couldn't say no. They touted themselves as a small startup railroad company, and their intention was for transloading only.
Ms. Barry, if you could wrap up now.
Okay. They need to expedite their project at that time, and they said that they would move on in 9 months if it hadn't been approved. 4 years later, we're here before you. If I may final comment here. We were wondering whether we had a role here because we didn't know if we were main principals, but we are the main principals. It is our health and it is our welfare that is threatened. We talked about NEPA. NEPA has put it very plainly. It says in order to carry out the policies set forth in NEPA, it must assure for all Americans safe, healthful, productive, aesthetically, and culturally pleasing surroundings. We ask you to adhere, look at us as a community, look at the damage that we have, look at the children with cancer, look at this site. This site is incompatible for this operation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barry. We'll proceed with Ms. Cleaver.
Thank you very much for having me here today to speak. I have family that lives in Massachusetts, and I've been recognized for doing extensive environmental work, especially on some solid waste sites. And I'd like to commend Kathleen Barry for what she's bringing up, and that's the reason why I'm here